everybody. I'm Roger Harrabin. I'm the BBC's Environment Analyst. I've been reporting this sort of stuff for a while, for a long while. I've known Michael a while too. I can see one familiar journalistic face in the audience, and I wonder what sort of interloper there is up there, the third row from the back. We're going to hear from Michael in a moment. I mean, I'll just offer a few thoughts on Paris. I spoke to one of the senior negotiators before leaving and said, what do you think? Expecting him to say, oh, really good or fantastic something. And he said, we set our highest benchmark and this result way exceeded our highest expectations. For me, I always expected a deal. I was betting on a deal for months and months and months. There were too many big players with enough invested into the system for there not to be a deal. The USA is staked on it, presidency is staked on it, reputation. China absolutely did not want to be the villain again. China was demonized, I think, rather unfairly over Copenhagen, and did not want to be the villain again. India was playing a quiet role. It was going to be very difficult for anybody to debate it. The UN system was just absolutely resolute on getting a result, and the French diplomacy was extraordinary. It was a brilliant effort in diplomacy. So I thought there would be a deal, but frankly, I'm amazed at the deal that they got. And the issue now will be, how do countries put it into practice? I mean, not just what do they do in 5 years' time, but what do they do now to put their economies, to start turning their economies around to a low carbon future? Because we can see already in the UK there's turbulence. Probably heard stuff on solar panels yesterday, the furore about the cuts to solar grants, and that's just one tiny element of what's been going on in UK energy policy. And that's in a country that is absolutely formally and legally committed to carbon cuts in the long term. We have a long-term framework that's the envy of all other nations in the world, of environmentalists in all other nations in the world, and yet in the UK we're suffering some severe policy turbulence. So I think somebody said this is not the end, it is the end of the beginning, and I think that's about right. It's a misquote from Winston Churchill, but I think it's about right. We've reached the end of the beginning, and now the world is starting to look at what it means to move towards a low carbon economy. And there's an awful long way to go. Anyway, I'll leave Michael to talk now. I'll reappear when he's finished, and we'll go into seminar format. I'm going to join the audience.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that background and view on the politics and the importance of the unexpected degree of the outcome. As you will have gathered, this is a somewhat unusual event, and we are combining what is the final session of a module of the UCL Master's course. And so what I'm doing in the next hour is fundamentally the final of the 10 lectures. I'm speaking primarily to the students that have been through the course. Well, we realised this was a standalone event. It could work as a standalone event because unlike all of the earlier material, which was really taking you through sort of foundations, the fact-based, the evidence, the analysis of energy and environment and policy issues, economic and political dimensions, this is the one where we turn fully to the international level, the international response and the nature of it. And given the level of interest in, of course the timing is no accident, given that I was asked by UCL to run the course this term, I looked at it once and said that's going to be really hard because I'll be in Paris for the 8th and 9th lectures, but at least I'll be back for the final one. So I hope we can give you a sense of students here, some useful and appropriate culmination of all that you've been hearing across all of the modules this term. And I hope that you feel it works and it adds to the zest and interest that we've opened it up to wider invitations right across UCL and selected external invitees. And it also means for the students here, we've slightly changed the format. We won't be able to have the breakout session. I'm sorry, but with the numbers here, and a number of new people, we won't be able to actually have a proper tea break. So, brace yourselves. We're going to go right through till just hopefully a little short of 5 o'clock. But it is very much split into the lecture part of it, followed by a panel with a couple of key internal UCL and a couple of external people, which Roger, I'm delighted to say, will also moderate and inject his own view around the politics, the processes, and Roger, if you so wish, any reflections on sort of the role of research sector, if any, when things get tough in the policy world. Now, in the lecture, what I want to do, and in fact, argue, in effect, for those of you who are not familiar with British transitions, the age of 21 is sometimes called the final coming of age. That may be a little dated, and most of you, I suspect, would rate it at 18 now, but, the climate agenda moves slowly. I definitely view and conclude that 21 years of COP negotiations, I'll explain the background, we have at last come of age. What I want to do in this talk is actually not dive straight into Paris, because actually, like most things that matter in life, to understand what is really significant in Paris, you have to understand some of the history. This is no longer a new agenda. It's slightly unnerving to realise I started researching in this sort of area in 1988. The UN negotiations were launched precisely 25 years ago. There has been a lot of history. So I shall start by just outlining one-page primer on negotiations and the history of the UN, history and evolution of the UN Framework Convention. I will then focus a bit more on the last few years' explicit road to Paris. I'll run through what I see as some key aspects of the COP21 outcome, offer not detailed but a broad evaluation of what I see as 4 sort of high-level what has really changed dimensions. And if time, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts on the role ahead, particularly around emissions mitigation, which I'll try and link back to the theme of this module around planetary economics and the full-up economics of the challenge. I should say that unusually you have been circulated with 2 slide packs. Mine, I confess, as usual, just in the last couple of hours. But also one from Axel Mikolova, a colleague of mine, who with remarkable speed sent me something on Monday afternoon, which was quite an extensive technical evaluation, and he's updated that. And that was incredibly helpful for me, because it means I have decided in this talk not to go through the real in-depth details of article this and what it means in that area and this area, because Axel's slide pack gives, I think, a good, ready introduction across many dimensions of the actual COP outcome, some of the terminology, as usual, lots of acronyms, etc. I actually think that given the nature of discourse, what I can best focus on is to give you a sense of international processes, the dynamics, the constraints, and where, at a slightly higher level, I think Paris enters. So the one-page primer on international negotiations, for those of you, not many of you are from an international affairs or international law background. Well, in a sense, the aim is just to reach an agreement. Under the United Nations, you are dealing with upwards of 190 countries. And a former boss of the Carbon Trust, Tom DeLay, said, well, frankly, businesses find it hard enough to strike a deal on 2. How on earth does anyone ever reach agreement amongst 190 political entities? Well, there is, over the last 60, 70 years, built up norms and procedures under the United Nations as to how you go about it, enshrined in the Vienna Law of Treaties, and typically terminology then splits, so the treaty is an international legal instrument, splits into a convention, which frequently is the foundational basis that may be followed by protocols to the convention. All of those are treaties. Attending UN negotiations makes watching paint dry seem like an exciting activity. They tend to be very slow, very ponderous, and frankly a lot of things that are very hard to understand if you're parachuted in. Partly because it takes several years even to reach a common understanding of why are they there, what are they talking about, and what does their language mean. If you're lucky, you then enter a process whereby countries draft text outlining what they want, and some poor soul in the Secretariat then has to start pulling together these various contributions into a compilation, then a sort of synthesis document which generally ends up completely unreadable because it has so many square brackets indicating where countries differ on various issues, and you then reach the culminating stage whereby you create a pressure cooker, typically 2 weeks, for bringing 190 sovereign states to see if they can emerge with a conclusion. If they do, if they're unlucky, that is adopted by consensus at the meeting, which is what happened on Saturday. Can I check how many people actually watched any of the events on Saturday? I mean, one great thing in the modern world is you can just sit there. Frankly, what I've realised in the last few years is I come home from these sessions and discover that people who've been watching on the web know more about what happened than I did. I'm not joking. You can actually see an awful lot. But that is basically we, the representatives in the room at the time, have not formally objected or been able to, in effect, say we consider this unacceptable. That tends to be followed fairly rapidly by signing, which is the government's officially saying, yes, our representatives did a good job, we support the agreement they hammered out. And then the tough bit, really, is when you take it through to national legislators to ratify the treaty. Now, there is one, and all treaties pretty much contain a threshold. They don't enter into force, i.e. become binding on anyone that's ratified until a certain threshold is crossed. In this case, it's 55 parties representing 55% of the global emissions, is the dual threshold for the Paris Agreement to enter into force, which actually is identical to the Kyoto Protocol provisions, except that that applies just to the industrialized countries. The paradox of international law is actually, despite the fact that most have very little capacity to enforce, adherence is just about as reliable as domestic law. The explanation for that paradox is really when you look at the pain that countries go through on that road of adoption, signing and ratification. The underlying deal is, if you're not going to stick to it, don't ratify. And if you do ratify and don't deliver, then in effect you're undermining the entire body of international law that you've agreed, negotiated painfully over the past half century. So I just thought I'd mention that because I often get questioned, how isn't the whole thing worthless because nobody can enforce it? And the answer is, well, nobody can genuinely enforce, but that does not make it worthless by any stretch. And indeed, some of the most potent battles in the last year have been about whether Paris would be legally binding. To move that generality into the Framework Convention on climate change, and I'll run you extremely rapidly through, in effect, good 15 years of negotiations. The foundational treaty is the UN Framework Convention, negotiated in '92, promptly signed and entered into force with remarkable rapidity. The US was one of the first countries to actually ratify that treaty in the final few months of the Bush senior presidency. The overarching objective is defined to be to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And there's additional clauses about the need to protect food supply and to enable development, and so forth. There's a principle in there called common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR for those in the jargon, and its enunciation in the convention is the division between industrialized countries defined as those listed in Annex 1 to the treaty, and all of the rest, with an additional subgroup of Annex 1 being the OECD-rich countries that have financial obligations. All the rest are non-Annex 1. If you ever hear people calling Annex 2 the developing countries, they've clearly lost the plot. And it sets up, I mean, it's actually a very smart treaty in its ways, despite certain flaw. And it basically sets up all of the institutional machinery to take this forward, including the annual conference of parties, the COP, and various subsidiary bodies and economist review, etc., etc. Well, the very first thing in the convention was it said, as soon as this entered into force, we must evaluate, is this convention adequate to solve the problem? And since it didn't have any legally binding constraints on emissions, the conclusion was, no, it's clearly not adequate. Therefore, they launched negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997, broadly on the understanding, and this was contentious even in the mandate for those negotiations, that it would deliver specific binding commitments on industrialized countries only, like Annex 1, to follow through the Convention's principle of leadership by the developed countries. I've given you a thumbnail sketch of Kyoto elements in relation to economic instruments in an earlier lecture. I'm not going to run through those. It combines legally binding with flexibilities, defined for a first period 2008 to 12, and all of the stuff that goes around that, largely designed actually by the US administration to enable flexibility in the use of market instruments. As you all know, however, the successor US administration under Bush Jr. Rejected Kyoto promptly. There was a few agonized years before the world, in fact, decided it would go ahead anyway. That entered into force, which meant that 2005 became a horrible acronym, COP10, COP1. ICMP being the meeting of Kyoto Protocol parties meeting alongside the convention. The continuation of Kyoto was then fulcrum, you might say, of the Copenhagen event, which I shall show you about now. The other thing to say, Canada later, just to finish off the Kyoto bit, Canada withdrew subsequently. All those that the US obviously never ratified. All of the industrialized countries that remained in Kyoto have in principle complied, but only with first periods. After Copenhagen, Japan and Russia said they would not sign up second periods, and the EU, New Zealand and Norway have done so. I think Australia signed, I'm not sure if it's ratified on that, and the EU has yet to ratify. But to return to the main theme of the UNFCCC, Copenhagen. Well, this was done. If you think the pressure building up to Paris was impressive, you should have lived through the pressure building up to Copenhagen. This was described by the world's media pretty much as humanity's last chance to save the planet, which is a little unfortunate since it collapsed in complete disarray. I will say a word about it, because it's very relevant to really understand just what Paris did achieve. I attended the session in Barcelona a month before Copenhagen. A couple of months before that, the European Union had announced that, well, obviously you could not solve the problem without the US. Obviously the US would never ratify the Kyoto Protocol. Therefore, obviously, the Kyoto Protocol could not solve the problem and had to be abandoned. At the Barcelona session, a month before Copenhagen, for once I actually took the time out to sit through plenary sessions of both the Conference of Parties and the Kyoto Protocol parties, 6 hours of denunciation wall to wall from developing countries. In effect saying, okay, so the deal you're proposing is that we, the developing world, should do a lot more, and in return, you, the rich world, will do a lot less, and abandon the only legally binding constraints that you face. Are you crazy? Do you think we're going to agree to that? And I must admit, I emerged from those 6 hours thinking Copenhagen's going to collapse. I don't see any alternative. And it was precisely over that schism that the Kyoto Protocol collapsed. It became more and more clear that the industrialized countries had kind of fooled itself into thinking the rest of the world would understand and accept the logic that I just outlined. It was clearer and clearer the developing world would absolutely no way accept that logic. In desperation, sort of beginning of the second week, President Sarkozy of France said, well, maybe we're going to have to accept something of Kyoto continuing, but obviously that then just led even further into shambles. The United Nations negotiations fell apart completely, aided by inept chairing from someone who seemed to know to run a European Council meeting but didn't have a clue really about UN negotiations. President Obama arrived on the final day, and history records how he more or less walked in on a group of the 4 major emerging economies, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, as a basic group. I basically said, are we going to leave here with absolutely nothing, or can we maybe fix a couple of pages? And the major mistake that President Obama made was then announcing on CNN that they had a deal. Well, that was kind of news to the 100 heads of state sitting in Copenhagen who proceeded to denounce the closed doors, intransparent, etc., by which some piece of paper had been reached, and many of them, heads of state who travelled to Copenhagen, didn't even have a clue what was there. Obviously, there'd been a bit of an outreach process, but it got pretty ugly. The best that was able was when the UN Secretary General, aided by several other efforts, managed to rescue the official UN process, noting the accord that had been produced in that small huddle. The judgments tell you something. The judgments afterwards in the EU was that Copenhagen diplomatic disasters did not come bigger than this. India, if you look carefully at the Indian press, it said this was a superb success, fundamentally because we resisted any attempt to impose any commitments on us to do anything. Slightly exaggerating, but not much. The US administration thought it was a great success because Obama, in effect, seemed to have saved the day with something and an outcome which actually had the main things that the US needed. China took most of the blame, as Roger's already said, and which I think was a little harsh, but in effect they became the symbolic defender of the G77 developing country position. And some people have been led to expect China would behave rather differently, which I was never convinced it would, and it did. So you then exited from that shambles wondering what on earth was this thing called the Copenhagen Accord in relation to UN. Before I delve into that, a few words about the content. The Copenhagen Accord, I say this is relevant if you want to really understand patterns. It actually endorsed the continuation of the twin track negotiations, i.e. something on Kyoto, and then a parallel global process. It recognised the scientific view that dangerous interference might mean staying below 2 degrees, blah, blah. Included sort of a couple of lines on that, adaptation, forestry, still maintain the divide of Annex 1, non-Annex 1 largely. This is where the 100 billion finance got logged into the system, and partly from the work from external and colleagues now at LSE. It established the Copenhagen Green Fund, well, that is to say, there should be a Copenhagen Green Fund, and said, we will have assessed the implementation and adequacy of this accord by 2015, in the light of the ultimate objective. Which is actually not bad for a couple of pages hammered out under those circumstances. Many countries had also been persuaded to bring forward national pledges up to 2020. And against all that background, there was an article which I thought had a rather nice phrase, you can see there. You could argue this was actually, and particularly with hindsight, the most successful failure ever in United Nations history. Why, even from a UN perspective, is because it laid the foundations for the road to Paris. And ultimately was the only thing that the UN process had that could grab on. At the top I've just put a little bit of the timeline of the various COPs, and this really brings us on to the theme of the road to Paris per se. So the Paris COP21 was the culmination of a 6-year process of reconstruction. The agenda of the first 3 of those COPs, Cancun to Doha, was largely about restoring the legitimacy of the UN process, and the first thing they had to do at Cancun was an official UN decision to adopt the Copenhagen Accord, more or less, essential features. They began, because there really was serious talk after Copenhagen that the UN was now dead, the UN process was dead, the UN was a waste of time. There was a lot of literature saying, thank God, get rid of that, just get some of the big countries together to fix the deal. There are multiple reasons, I think, why that did not happen, why countries returned to the UN, but they had a lot of reconstruction. Durban was particularly important for Paris in the sense that it was in Durban that they announced the Durban Platform with the timeline of 2015, the principles of things building up over the 4-year period to the next major agreement. Worth saying actually also that following on Doha, glancing through some of the issues of the Climate Policy Journal, I edit, and we've got spare copies if people want to have a quick flip through and take any away. And that included a review of Doha and its decisions around Kyoto, etc., and all of the things. By Doha in 2012, it was obvious the UN was now again the main game in town. That was what all the political energy would be focused on, and that the key thing the international process was dealing with was this fundamental question about common but differentiated responsibilities. And it was trying to foster the political conditions that would enable the world to move beyond what brought Copenhagen down. Now, you could say, inevitably, to solve this problem, you need a solution which is both broad and deep. And the one-liner that I found myself injecting in the run-up to Paris was, Paris is going to be conceptually very simple. It will complete the transition from a regime that was deep but narrow, and it got so narrow that there was very little left other than the EU sort of dancing on the Kyoto commitment. And COP21 will complete the swap to a regime which is broad and thereby necessarily shallow. And that is actually, in one sense, what we've got. But it's now what I think we can start probing a little bit. So, let's come on to Paris itself. Here you will see the change of format is deliberate because there's a couple of slides I simply snitched from Axel Nicolosa's presentation. I thought he did a very nice job. It is the largest number of participants in history. It collects in even Copenhagen, more than 30,000 present. It was a big site, but very well organised. In fact, we've been blessed by the fact that both Lima and Paris, I think, have been exceptionally well both laid out and organised logistically, which is not a trivial feat for this number of people and these many things going on. It has the largest number of heads of state under one roof ever, anywhere, as far as I know. And significantly, they were there on the first day, not the last day. The thinking in Copenhagen had been, this was going to be tough, you had to bring in the heads of state to crunch the final deal, because only they had the authority to change the national position to make major concessions. The result of Copenhagen was the opposite. You had 150 highly ego-filled heads of state who knew virtually nothing about the real substance and arrived basically wishing to grandstand to defend their national position back home, and that made Copenhagen outcome even worse. This final thing, incidentally, is one testament to French presidency and the sheer effort, because a lot of people said after Copenhagen, you will never get heads of state to come to another climate meeting. I don't know if you remember that, Roger. People said it's just so embarrassing, such a waste of their time. Yet, that got turned around, it cultivated, 6 years was enough to get them together on the opening day, where their job instead was to basically say, we need a deal, we must have a deal, this is one of the most important conferences ever. I instruct my negotiators to be flexible enough to ensure that the world emerges from this with a solution. And then you left it to the ministers to come in during the second half of the last week, who knew enough detail to handle the negotiations to their conclusion. It was no question a real diplomatic triumph for the French presidency, which was highly competent, seasoned diplomat, knew UN processes as well as EU's, one of the leading experts about really high level, Laurence Toubiana, as their special envoy, very close relationship with the UN Secretariat, all those things that you really need. I think Dr. Joe DePledge once said, you know, a good presidency cannot force a deal that countries don't want one, but a bad presidency sure can prevent them reaching a deal even if they wanted one. This was the best of presidencies in countries that wanted a deal, as Roger said. I had close working right through with the Peruvian presidency from the year before, diplomatic masterstroke for Laurent Fabius to say right at the outset, he's going to be on the platform right alongside me. I don't care the protocol, I want the Peruvians right beside me to demonstrate this is a fully north-south integrated, etc. And as I said, have been choreographed over the previous 15 months, starting with the UN summit and the US-China announcement that followed. Has to be said that also Paris was blessed with quite a few wins of fortune. You kind of felt everything conspired badly for Copenhagen, and the opposite was true for Paris. In only the months shortly before, you had the disposal, so to speak, so that's not quite the right word. Tony Abbott was displaced as the Australian Prime Minister, followed by Canadian elections, which displaced Stephen Harper. Therefore, there was no significant dispute within the industrialised countries. I think we may underestimate the significance of the collapse of some of the prices that we talked briefly before, because it made it seem possible to the developing countries that there could be such a thing as low carbon or carbon compatible development. You had South Africa, the host of the Durban conference, actually being the presidency of the G77 group of developing countries, and in their opening statement invoking the themes of Mandela, the philosophy, the words of hope, compromise, reconciliation, all of that came through in spades from the country that had officially launched this process 4 years earlier and was chair of the developing country group. President Modi in India was a bit of a breath of fresh air in a country which had been traditionally really very intransigent. And as if that wasn't enough, the climate also conspired to remind people that the global warming cause was largely a fantasy all along. It was obscured partly by the El Niño cycles. And I say even finally, the tragedy of the Paris attacks made people arrive with a resolve to show solidarity with France. And as I said, first day of COP21 was not only the largest ever gathering heads of state, actually it was an extraordinary rollout of all sorts of initiatives that have been cooking up in all over the world, various initiatives, coalitions, mission innovation, 20 countries promising to double their R&D, the Bill Gates-led Energy Breakthrough Coalition, the World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Frankly, I'm sorry, I've lost track of just how many different things were launched, and many of them announced on the first day. With Canada running around as this entity that had been difficult only up to 2 months before, basically signing up to endorsing and calling for stronger action on just about everything. Along with those alliances, city alliances, financial sectors, and so forth. So, you know, there was a hell of a lot going on already from the first day. Now, what was the actual outcome? As I say, if you want to know the details, look at the presentation we circulated from Axel. At the end of this presentation, there's a couple of slides of web links on many aspects of this. I'll touch on some of the highlights, and in terms of sort of the content, I'll try and summarise it this way. And I know there's quite a few words here, but I'm trying to inject at least some of the key actual words so that you can see what the text was they signed. There was a specific interpretation of the UN ethics, was the objective. Hard-fought negotiations which sort of steadily ratcheted the 2 degrees into being well below 2 degrees, and a lot of pressure to also include the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level. Something I think we might like to come back to in discussion. It also elevated adaptation to be on a par with the primary objective, and the financial flows to enable both of the above as a key highline objective. Terminology. The words of principles of equity are absolutely still there and replete. The words common differentiated responsibilities are still there, but only in a phrase which refers to respective capabilities and in the light of different national circumstances. Now, if an acronym CBDRRCDNC strikes you as a little bit mouthy, you need to understand the history. All of those added letters basically mean the world has changed. There is no easy distinction between rich and poor, Annex 1, non-Annex 1. And indeed, but you know, a whole set of graduation defined by the fact that countries in various different stages of development capability, sophistication, all sorts of ways. The terminology of going into it was every country was called upon to submit intended nationally determined contributions, with many, many months of negotiations in earlier years around each of those words, pretty much. 187 countries had done so by the end of the COP, nearly all of them beforehand, setting out their objectives for 2025 and 2030. The text, as I stressed, there was one journalist report, I hate to say it, Roger, but from the BBC, not the UK, saying differentiation is dead. Rubbish. Complete rubbish. Differentiation is not dead. Differentiation is replete throughout the agreement. But, and this was the thing I was astonished to see almost no overt recognition of, nowhere in the entire text is there any reference to Annex 1 and non-Annex. That's significant because that implies that this is understood as overcoming the strict list of who's rich and who's not, in favour of there's just a very complicated world out there. There's countries that are much richer than others. There's countries like China, which are actually still poorer but have immense technological and engineering capacity. India is also an industrial country buried in a sea of nearly 1 billion very poor people, right through to Burkina Faso, Sub-Saharan Africa, so forth. So differentiation's changed its meaning. It no longer means north versus south. It means countries at a wide range of stages of development and the ability to respond according to those respective capabilities and national circumstances. There was a tremendous debate over legal form. And there's again a long history. This is not a legal group. I don't want to drag you through it, not least because I wouldn't understand it beyond the sort of surface. But what emerged was a legally binding agreement. Use that word for a second because that's the word in the Paris Agreement. With the quantified contributions in a non-binding form. So a legal agreement is something where the numbers cannot be enforced and they're worded. So which is exactly like the Convention's requirements on industrialised countries. Look back, there were sort of numbers indications in there, but in a clearly a form that couldn't be held to as a specific number. There was unprecedented attention to the division between 2 bits of what came out. Between the COP adoption decision, which is a decision by the Conference of Parties there in the room, versus the agreement itself, which is the legal text that countries are expected to take back home for due process. What is due process? Well, I started with that sort of outline for a reason, because this is written in every respect you could think of as a treaty under the United Nations. Except, you don't call it a treaty, it's called an agreement. The reason for that, and it has entry into force provisions and all the legal paraphernalia The reason is that it is very regarded as clear and universally accepted that the US Congress is in such a state that it is extremely unlikely to ratify anything from the UN that has the words climate change. And ratification in the US Senate requires a 2/3 majority, in other words, 67 votes out of 100 senators. And this agreement may be the first in history, I don't know, but has been deliberately and transparently negotiated in a form specifically intended to avoid the requirement for ratification by the United States. Now, the entry into force still refers to a number of ratifications, so they're relying on other countries to bring this thing into force. The US will and intends, and has been very transparent, it intends to take this forward through executive order by the President. And I've included some links onto the legal arguments as to why that is sufficient. And the root of it, the reason is, you could argue, a bit sad. It's basically because the US argues Paris does not require the US to do anything different. That basically means, because the treaty or the agreement does not require any specific additional action by the United States, therefore the Senate has no business claiming any jurisdiction over this. The administration is acting entirely within its legal mandate and authority. This is a simply follow-on implementation of the Framework Convention. So you can ponder that, but that was pretty clear. One other feature to mention about the process is that it was the most blatant interpretation we have yet seen of the fact that consensus does not mean everybody. Typically, you think that's what consensus means. Kind of in the United Nations, it never has quite, but it's tended to mean that in the pressure cooker of the final meeting, you say, this is the deal, does anybody dare to object? And you hope that no country delegate wishes to bear the entire global opprobrium of blocking the treaty. Estrada in Kyoto, I told you how he handled that. That was a masterful way of doing it. There were a lot of mutterings, but no country formally objected after Kyoto. Fabius handled this in a different way. If you watch very closely, when he brings the agreement back to the podium on Saturday afternoon, whenever it was, 5:30, after repeated delays to address minor errors and other important haggles, including an extremely important round about the word should or shall. I'm not joking. He basically said, we have an agreement, I declare this agreement adopted, I am delighted to tell you we have an agreement. He did not look up the ordinance. Because the French diplomacy had been so extensive and the effort so immense, including in the final days, when I'm told the lawyers spent 60 hours without any sleep, that he knew exactly who would support this, and the fact that there were 4 countries that would not support it. And he basically said, well, I'm sorry, but the vast majority includes everybody that really matters here. And if you then sit through all of the country statements afterwards, eventually you will get to Nicaragua saying, I thought actually, to be fair, in quite polite and reasonable terms, we really don't like being treated this way. You know that we do not agree with this. We'd like to explain why we don't agree with this. And everyone sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, we know. We kind of maybe sympathise, but the fact is, this was the only thing. This is the thing. And thank you for not making even more noise about it, because you can't stop it anyway. I mean, I am obviously ad-libbing, but that was the tone of the reaction. So this time it was kind of 4 countries saying, you know, guys, this is really not very fair for multiple reasons. Historical responsibility, we'd like to see more, something about compensation, we've lost all the different, various things. Go watch, see what we think. But that was the way that Paris was adopted. A little more about what's in it, and I won't go into much depth on this. There's a rather nice diagram produced by the World Resources Institute that I finished to try and give a sense of what they saw as the 5 key elements and the thousands of other things that happened. The key elements really were to build on, buttress, and develop these what are now NDCs. They have dropped the I. These are now nationally determined contributions, not just intended. There will be longer-term goals with 5-year review and a global stock take, or where we've got to. Adaptation elevated to equal prominence, I've mentioned that. There is recognition in there of loss and damage, the fact that climate change is occurring, it is hurting people, adaptation cannot stop that. There is a live saw running and officially deferred now till next year around so what, if anything, should be done about loss and damage inflicted broadly by historical emissions. Fairly universal provisions on monitoring, reporting, verification, finance, reinforced and extended beyond 2020 at 100 billion a year at least, out to 25, and to rise thereafter. Recognise the call needs to build capacity, etc. Those are the sort of the core Paris Agreement provisions, and it's all open for signature on the 22nd of April for 1 year at the United Nations in New York. Also worth saying, on the right-hand side here, added acknowledgement that the current NDCs are insufficient. That's kind of putting it mildly, as we'll show in a moment. Embodies recognition and encouragement of all sorts of other things going on in society beyond the UN. And I'll come back on this last point about sort of the social grounding of climate action and the fact that that, I think, implies a new dynamic. But let me just touch on first a couple of the points about ambition, the mitigation numbers. So the global goal, as said, is to keep warming, the way I would interpret it, is between 1.5 and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It implies peaking as early as possible, recognise that industrialised countries have to peak and expected to have economy-wide earlier. The long-run emissions goal is thereby to achieve a balance of emissions and sinks by the second half of the century. That's what had been called net zero, but political concerns about that is switched phrase in the IPCC reports on that one. And there'll be a global stock take, formally from 2023, but with an initial review in 2018. On the right-hand side, you can see some of those numbers. If you really want to know, that's what's been happening with global emissions. I'll show this again in a second. Here are some of the scenarios, and here is sort of the range of 1.5 to 2. Rather major turnaround. As indicated, all countries participate in nationally determined contributions. They're to be ratcheted upwards every 5 years is the implication. Industrialised countries should have absolute emission targets, and developing countries should move over time towards that. Again, more graphs on the right-hand side underline the same kind of point, except that more specifically it's recognised that when you add up the INDCs that were submitted, the national goals of 2030, they seem to imply something like 55 gigatons. And if you really believe the 1.5 or at least even the 2, you've got to be down around 40. That's a huge gap of ambition compared to what has been nationally on offer. And just to stress that in a bit more detail, here is the trajectory of, if you like, in the red, sort of typical projections of business as usual. The blue here is the estimated range of emission trajectories, global emission trajectories. This is CO2 equivalent for 2 degrees. And by most reckoning, the INDC range, which is that little black box in the middle, is, shall we say, consistent, most consistent with a pathway of about 3 degrees. 2.7 has actually become the norm. But I know several research groups, including here at UCL, saying they're kind of scratching their heads and they don't think they can really get down to 2.7. It's more like 3. But point is, it's a long way from anything like 1.5. Also worth saying that one thing that hasn't hugely changed is, whilst a lot of the industrialised world has been really focused on the emissions problem, mitigation, fair to say a lot of the developing world, I use that term broadly now, say, well, actually, what really matters in this is the financial package. There they had to swallow hard and accept the fact that the financial pledges are in the COP decision, not the agreement. And that was precisely because of this US ratification. Anything which legally required the US to use more finance cannot be delivered by the administration without going to Congress. Therefore, they could not sign it, they could not proceed. So it's in the COP decision, not the legal agreement. Adaptation, they really, really care about. Loss and damage, big issue for many developing countries. Technology, also a very big issue, and there's been a lot of slow, gradual nurturing of the technology agenda through the previous COPs. It's got maybe slightly greater prominence. There's a side decision linking potential links of finance and technology. I don't have time to elaborate much, although I'll offer a thought at the end in that area if I have time. If you are interested in this, please do take the trouble to go back and read the decision and agreement text. Some of it may be a bit incomprehensible. It's fairly UN Japanese, although frankly not as much as often. But it's good to get a sense of what's there, and we've given you a list of blogs and other commentaries in the annex of this presentation. Okay, so without going into any more of the detail, there's quite a lot of quite significant detail in there. Let me offer a couple of thoughts about what I call a high-level evaluation. Let me actually start with a thorny question. I had a phone call actually with one of the leading South African researchers only yesterday, and I raised this question about fairness, and he said, well, it's really nice to know that someone at least recognises this issue. Because is it fully fair? Remember the story I told you about the Barcelona meeting just before Copenhagen? Well, actually, that is precisely what developing countries have had to swallow. They have offered to do a lot more, and in return, the industrialised world has escaped any legally binding quantified commitments. There's no real recognition in there of the concept of historical responsibilities. It's a complicated concept. It's not simple, but one could say it's irrelevant. There's a whole climate justice movement. The words are mentioned in the preamble. It's one of the reasons I think why Venezuela was more accommodating than previous ones, is because, again, smart move, Laurence Fabius had asked the Venezuelans to help work on all the preamble text, which meant they could put in the words that were symbolically important, but they don't really have much legal or operational force. But they're there as an acknowledgement that some of these concepts are important for many of the countries. And the deal does reflect the balance of power and US exceptionalism, the hoops the world went through in order to try to deal with the US constitutional and political realities, was, from some respects, you could say, well, obviously needed, but it's also kind of, well, this is a world of 196 countries, and so much effort made to address the fact that the US may say, oh, we could do that, we could never get that through Congress, never. Well, you know, can you imagine if every big country like India said, well, try that, but actually the Loksab would never agree to that, so trust us. At the end of the day, this comes down a lot to trust. Yeah? People trusted the process, they trusted the presidency, the secretariat, they trusted the Obama administration. The Obama administration said, guys, we kind of like to help, but there's no way we can without going to Congress, and that would kill the whole thing. By and large, and that was the final crunch. Xi Jinping came in and said, okay, I'll accept that. And so that degree of trust in countries who are doing the best that they could, I think, was also important. But it does mean, I think, it's a stretch to say it's fully fair. On the other hand, is it sufficiently fair? And in the real world, I think that is an equally, at least, important. Developing countries have had much more prominence given to their concerns in various dimensions. It extensively recognises differentiation. It doesn't bind numerical commitments on developing countries in any form. There's pressure, but not compulsion. Difficulties will still loom over the coming years. I think that always, in my experience, after a big crunch COP of this sort, which reaches a major decision, the next year tends to be filled with countries kind of trying to back down and say, well, we don't really mean that, we interpreted this in this way. So there'll be quite a lot of, a bit of soreness coming through the system. I think the most material one would emerge if there's too much pressure from developing countries on the loss and damage agenda, or too little implementation from the rich, well, and the financials implementation. Those are the two big things which could really start to, if you like, destroy the atmosphere of Paris. Another question, is it legitimate? The US had special treatment to circumvent Congress. Reasonable? Is it legitimate? I mean, hey, democracy, Senate and Congress is there for a reason. There are lots of other aspects of that argument we might pick up in discussion. I don't want to belabor it here. ALBA, the group that people in Nicaragua spoke up for this, Asociación Latino Bolivarian America, was effectively overridden. Again, legitimate, to discuss. My view broadly, which I think is proof is in the pudding, to use an old phrase, the overwhelming endorsement. And I don't just mean, yeah, we accept this deal, but actually pretty much 190 countries saying, this is a good deal, we stand by it, we believe in it, we will take this forward. The atmosphere on Saturday was extraordinary. And in that sense, I think that is proof of sufficiently fair in the world of real politics and sufficiently legitimate. You will see obviously debates back in the US Congress, US domestic. I'm sure you will see debates in the Lok Sabha, in the Indian press, etc. But nevertheless, I would say that is a reasonable assessment, and at the end of the day, it's true that perfection is the enemy of the good, is an old and very true saying, and particularly in the UN negotiations. I do not see how Paris could have actually been any better, which I think is more or less logical. A couple of other points before I move towards the final remarks. Paris Agreement is a necessary condition, UN negotiations are a necessary condition for things that matter in tackling climate change, but at the end of the day, they are probably less than half of the story. I already have mentioned the display of other activities, much more than ever before. If you think about it, the UN cannot be the forum for serious implementation. I mean, how could you expect 190 countries to agree all of the details of exactly what they will do, their domestic policy implementations, etc., etc.? There are some things it has to be, or at least infinitely better. You do absolutely want the UN to be the court of common accounting to prevent cheating with numbers. Well, we'll count these emissions because we exported a clean good there, but that country still counts emissions, so forth. And the evaluation, where are we going? Is it adequate? Is it consistent with our objectives? Those things are cemented in Paris. Paris also, and the UN, even framed the convention, embodies a duty to encourage joint efforts, i.e. plurilateral, multilateral, sub-global arrangements to further implementation. This is something that developed significantly just in the last 9 months. Because there had been very much a historical legacy that, the UN was where it was really at and commitments were where it's really at. And you got more and more recognition of all the other things going on. But also recognition that there'd been a lot of talk about clubs of countries spinning off and doing other things. That had been largely framed, and I have to say largely framed by the academic economic sector as the alternative, as UN stuff, a complete waste of time for a group of countries to get together and sort. That has completely reversed. There is now absolute recognition that anybody who knows anything should recognise the agenda of clubs is about groups of countries getting together to work out how to further the implementation of their nationally determined contributions and hopefully to go further within the framework of the UN process, which is exactly like the World Trade Organization, where the World Trade Organization could not make any progress, really, if it were not for the plethora of regional trade agreements and other sub-trade agreements. Now it's perceived that's the relationship, and that is how the relationship really should be. And that, I think, is changing. So, and this is now very much my personal take, my final, if you like, remark and evaluate the Paris Agreement. What's it actually changed? What's it done? I mean, a bunch of national declarations that aren't legally binding or enforceable. I think there's four fundamental changes, as I see, arising from Paris. The first is that 23 years after we established the UN objective, fundamental objective, we finally have an interpretation of what avoiding dangerous interference means. And it resides in the phrase, well below 2, striving for 1.5. Now, again, there's something we may come back to. It is a highly ambitious interpretation viewed from the standpoint of delivery. Viewed from the other end, you could say, well, there's a fair chance that even 1.5 means that 5 of the 195 nations in the UN will cease to exist. That's a pretty weak interpretation of dangerous interference. So, but nevertheless, at least we have a UN treaty, I will call it that, that defines what it means. The second is differentiations alive, but the firewall is dead. We are all in this together. That I've talked through, underlined my view that the significance of, I'm phrase, the dog that doesn't bark from the Paris Agreement, namely the absence of a formal dividing list. Many other dimensions to that sense. We're all in this together, and I would actually argue that the various other things, the elevation of adaptation, the financing, etc., are largely manifestations of the fact that this is a truly global agreement in which the concerns of countries right around the world were recognised and countries did their best to accommodate them. Again, came through very strongly in the closing statements. Just look how many countries thanked Laurent Fabius for listening to their concerns. Third, this is an evolutionary solution. Kind of always was, sort of. But this is clearly framed as not the last word. No pretense it's the last word. This is the template for a solution which evolves and is designed and intended to evolve, not just in time, but in space as countries' capabilities to develop, their circumstances change. And potentially it could also evolve in legal form in ways that we delve into. And finally, and again I've mentioned this, I'd say the fourth definitive change is this is a global social endeavour. Just read sections 4 and 5, I believe it is, of the COP decision. This is not the UN saying, it's all right guys, trust us, we've solved the problem. This is the UN saying, the world needs everyone's help in helping to deliver this beyond the nation states, sub-actors, California, cities across the world, financial sector, everything else needs to be brought to bear. Now, to some degree, this is in itself a revolution in international governance, at least in the UN, and perhaps moreover, the assumptions underpinning it. And the way it goes about it is actually some of the strongest provisions, and I think Aptil's evaluation also said this, are actually rooted in transparency, multi-level solutions, private sector, social pressures, and so forth. In that sense, you could say this isn't so much of something you could call a protocol to the convention. This is basically a fundamental updating of the UN Framework Convention to be fit for the world of the 21st century, the world of social media, the world of hugely complex different levels of development. So they are, if you like, broadly my thoughts and interpretation of what happened and culminated last Saturday. I have already talked to you for a little while. I think I will, if you don't mind, add just 2 more slides. And here, let me stress, that's the COP21 discussion. I'm just going to offer a couple of thoughts on where from here, in only one specific angle. It's the angle that I know best that is most relevant to this master's course on planetary economics and the energy and dimensions of that. And it's concerning, so what about this whole agenda of international cooperation? Well, the students here will recognise the slide on the right. It was my attempt to encapsulate the fact that any coherent energy policy response to this needs to have three fundamental pillars for really quite fundamental economic reasons. And that the key thing that we have been so bad at in the past is A, accepting that, and B, thinking and understanding how they can help to reinforce each other. I'm not going to, apologies for those of you to whom this is complete Greek, but I will not talk you through the components, or the students here, I hope, will know what this means. I think global mitigation effort has to be grounded in all three of these things, of which, in effect, you could say this represents, or in a way of thinking about, the full pipeline of developing, improving, accelerating, diffusing lower carbon technologies which will actually on the ground help to solve this problem, and practices and business models, etc. And what you could say is the early stage of this, effectively the third pillar, early stage innovation dimension, is captured in part in the Mission Innovation Programme, the double R&D, the Breakthrough Coalition I referred to, Bill Gates. That's where the early stage innovation stuff is now has a home to happen. The diffusion of developing countries, their primary concerns about the knowledge, the capacity to assimilate emerging technologies to diffuse, the Technology Executive Committee, the technology networks, that is broadly a home for the first of this stuff. It's around helping countries, institutions, markets move towards utilising the best of what is actually technologically available. And of course, centrally there is a role to pricing. But my sense is where in actual architectural terms this can fit in is really in part from the financial ones. There's the COP financial package and institution, there's investors and disinvestment alliances. I don't think that just on paper is enough. Some of you will recognise that this is the third level of the innovation chain diagram that Will presented last week. And the key thing is that if you want major, big technology development, you have to have money and dependable money. And you could argue that's precisely what the UK didn't do with its CCS decision a few weeks ago. You have to, industry has to have some confidence that as technology moves from hundreds of millions into billion scale, there's got to be a dependable source of money to help the scaling up. And the markets, the investors, the private sector needs to know there's going to be credible markets in which low carbon technologies will be more and more valuable and higher value in the markets. And that has to strategically grow. Now, I won't run into all the details there, but to me, designing coalitions which span what have been previously two different homes, the technology engineering peaks over there and the economist carbon pricing peaks over there, is actually the single most fundamental thing that has to be stitched together if we're actually going to deliver anything close to what has now been defined as the objective. So that's just one example. What do you conclude? Well, basically, it's the old saying, is this glass half full or half empty? If you want to argue it's half empty, you can say, my God, 25 years after we started, there are no legally binding quantified commitments to cut emissions that anybody can actually enforce. How pathetic. If you want to say half full, you can say lots and lots and lots of other things on the other side of the ledger. And I thought I would leave you with two of the quotes. It was fascinating listening to the final statements on Saturday. I just pulled out two phrases, which I think encapsulate this. The first was from the Maldives, for the small island states. History will judge us not by what we did today, but what we do on this day forward. But I thought it was interesting that Ban Ki-moon, I thought, had a great phrase. We could debate was he right or wrong, but it's one hell of a phrase. What was once unthinkable is now unstoppable. And I think that it will maybe say your generation will have a rather major part to play in whether that proves to be correct. Thank you very much.
Okay, so look, thank you, Michael. I'll be honest, I thought I was going to fall asleep in that lecture because I'm so completely knackered, but I didn't, and that's a massive credit to Michael, because I really thought I was on the way there. I just want to put a few thoughts as somebody who's followed these things for a long time. The first is to say, this is a social science. It is based on a foundation of physical sciences. The physical sciences themselves are fundamentally uncertain. So the range of projected temperature rise for doubling of CO2 is between 1.5 and 4.5 Celsius. So what happens to the world is very much dependent on what happens in the physical world. So what happens to the economic world is dependent on what happens in the physical world. And there are uncertainties around that. And it's very easy when we talk about economics and politics to forget those uncertainties of the physical world. And they are an important component, I think. The UN has taken a precautionary approach, but that's very much an approach which will affect the way things move forward. I wanted to say another couple of things. I mean, there was so much to say. I mean, Michael talked about somebody in the BBC saying something about differentiation was dead. I mean, I was reporting the exact opposite. I think we've seen something rather remarkable here. I think we've seen a struggle to an eventually kind of successful effort to codify a new world order. The old world order was very clearly developing and developed countries, and it is absolutely clear now to everyone, it's been thrashed out in debate in Paris, it's been completely clear that there are different alliances between countries, rich or poor, more or less vulnerable, more or less polluting, and that the old world order has gone. And all the differentiation language which finds its way threaded through the entire text is representative of that, and that was a massive, massive change. In terms of who you're following, I haven't seen your list, but one of the best accounts I've seen of this is by Andy Revkin. I don't know if you know Andy. His Twitter is @Revkin, Revkin. Used to work for the New York Times. He's now their blogger, and he's a very smart guy and very well connected. I mean, if you're interested in following me, I'm @Harrabin on Twitter too. In terms of other things, Michael mentioned things not being able to be, the exceptionalism of the US, and that was absolutely remarkable. But we kind of all knew and have known forever that the US wouldn't be able to sign. It's very difficult to say what would happen if there were to be a President Trump elected, for all sorts of reasons. It would be an interesting world, would it not? But it's very difficult to say quite what he would do. Some people in the States think that what has happened already is unstoppable. So there may be attempts to reverse it, but you're seeing already a drop in 2/3 in the price of coal stocks. And once states start investing in low carbon technology, prices will come down further. The trend may be unstoppable. So some people are more sanguine about a change in the election than others. On the other hand, there are other people warning that although Obama is saying all the measures have been taken needed to meet the US commitments, and Republicans in the Senate believe that Obama is missing 30% of his carbon cuts. And there are attempts even now to try to open that up, to prove that he signed up to something that he had no right to sign up to. So that story is not dead. I want to say something briefly as well about what's happened in the change in relationships between developed and developing countries. Michael mentioned solar. I mean, I can't mention solar strongly enough. It has been absolutely massive. So in the old negotiations, there used to be talk about burden sharing. And now the African countries, their eyes have lit up because they can see this is a massive opportunity for them. If they can get their hands on money to bring solar technology to their countries, that's not a burden. It's a massive development tool. So this whole thing, the drop in prices of solar, has helped to reframe the entire climate change issue which I think is massive. And something else finally, and I'll stop talking now because you've got wonderful other speakers to come, is the role of innovation. Firstly, a cautionary one, which is that you can hear a lot of politicians now saying, oh, well, of course, I think this will all be solved through innovation. A salutary tale is that innovation for a new technology to come through, Paul will talk about this, I dare say, it takes 40 years to maturity for a technology to come through. So you may be able to see some improvements in technology and carbon capture and storage which bring the price down, But for a new technology to come through to scale takes 40 years. Look at solar, we started in the 70s, now it's cost competitive in 2015. So let's not be over-optimistic that technology is going to dig us out alone. It is not. And finally, a thought on cities and subnationals, actors, which is what the UN calls them. I mean, we have had a complete revolution in the US now, in the UN now, in the way that other actors are really recognised, apart from just the nation states. So the C40 group of cities, which is well worth looking into, and now have 80 cities in C40 cities, doubled their numbers, and that they are global megacities who are cooperating together and learning from each other, very often way outpacing their own national leaders, and setting a benchmark for smaller cities in their own states. There's a massive amount going on. California is a world leader in its policy. Whatever the US is doing, California is going its own way. And one of the most compelling speakers I saw actually in the conference was Arnie Schwarzenegger, who came and delivered a fantastic speech and then actually gave a lecture to all just like this in Paris of MA students. He was a brilliant speaker. If you Google Arnie vegetarian, you'll see the tip of my nose, because I interviewed Arnie and I thought, well, I warned the cameraman. I said, look, just be very careful. At the end of the interview, I'm going to ask him this question. I'm not sure if he's going to punch me or put me in a headlock or say, oh, you funny guy, or walk off the stage, but it could be really dramatic. And for my final question, he'd given this exhortatory speech on climate change. And I said, well, you know, do you think you are partly to blame because there's a whole generation of young men now who are cramming their mouths with steak and whey powder in order to build muscles like the Terminator? And I was bracing myself. and he said, yes, you're absolutely right. And we mustn't eat so much meat, and it's unrealistic to ask people to become vegetarians 100%. But we could ask people to start 2 days a week vegetarian. I was so gobsmacked I couldn't think of anything to say. But anyway, he didn't punch me. I think the best thing to do now is if we go to Simon Sharpe, I think, we'll keep it general a bit. Simon's going to talk a bit about the agreement and a bit about the UK's role in it.
Sure.
Simon, could you keep it to sort of 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, I was going to say, keep it short so we can discuss. Michael's already given such an incredible overview, and Roger, I agree with everything you added to that. So I want to add some personal reflections, and my starting point really, I suppose, is Michael's question about, is this a glass half full or half empty? Now, I think it's fair to say over the last 2 years, I've been just about the most critical person inside government of the UNFCCC process. Ever since I went to one of these meetings in Doha, which I think was in 2012, I saw just what a horrific process it is. And so I think it was with, it's a great tribute to the sense of irony of my boss, that he put me in charge of communications. Having done that, I've had to think very carefully about how can I really communicate this deal in a way that would be convincing for people like me, who are actually quite skeptical about what that process can achieve. And I think I've landed on one that's a little bit perhaps more optimistic than the quote of the head of Greenpeace. What he said about it was, it won't get us out of the hole that we're in, but it might make the sides of the hole a little bit less steep. I think that's quite good. That's a good way of thinking about it. But there's a chance that it might be something better than that. And I propose a slightly different metaphor, which is, if you think about pushing a car on a swing, you give a very small push and there's a very large motion. Why does that happen? Because of resonance. You're pushing at exactly the right point, at exactly the right time. The most effective point to change a system is just when it's at the turning point. That's when you apply your push. Now, I think Michael's said enough about the deal for all of us to recognize that it has been quite a fairly substantial push. there's 190 countries committed to reducing their emissions over time. Something like 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent reduction in global annual emissions by 2030. 20 countries committing to double their R&D, lots more committing to carbon pricing, and so on and so on. So it is quite a significant push. Now, I think the interesting thing is there are, I would say, 3 signs that the global energy economy might be somewhere near some kind of a turning point. One of those is that 2 years ago, for the first time ever, annual additions of electricity generating capacity in renewable energy exceeded those of fossil fuels. So in other words, we added more renewable energy generating capacity in that year than we did fossil fuel generating capacity. That's the first time that's happened. So that was one turning point. Second one is, in some parts of the world, renewable energy is now just about getting level with fossil fuel energy in terms of cost. Onshore wind in windy countries and solar energy in very sunny countries, they're both actually getting quite close. So that's your second turning point. Of course, once it gets cheaper and if you've got the storage to go with it, then you're winning. And the third one is that this year, it looks as if global emissions may have actually gone down while the global economy went up. And if that's correct, that would be the first time that's happened. The group that's done that analysis is not saying that this means we're at global peak emissions, but they are saying it's evidence that that trajectory is starting to really change. It's a very, very hopeful sign. So I think for all those 3 reasons, it feels like we might actually be at some kind of a turning point. And we have just given it the best push that we could have done within the context of this particular system. So that's why I think there are grounds for optimism. But I completely agree that we will be judged very much on what we do afterwards. And to summarize, really 3 things that I think are key. One is we've got to keep leading by example. We can't force other countries to do what we want, so we will have to keep leading by example. Secondly, we'll have to negotiate on specific actions. And as Michael said, these will be complementary to the long-term commitments, but they will add to them, and if we do it right, we can accelerate progress that way. And thirdly, we do have to invest enormously in technology, because when you look at these, I think it's really important just to emphasize this point about not knowing how much climate change we're going to get. There are 2 huge uncertainties. One is where global emissions are going to go. And if you see this number of 2.7 degrees, then that's based on a scenario in which global emissions go down progressively after 2030 to about 0 by the end of the century. That is one hell of an enormous guess. We really have no idea if they're going to do that or not. You can explain the assumptions and you can explain the rationale, but it's still an enormous guess. And the second one is how the climate responds to that. And as Roger said, there's an enormous uncertainty there. In fact, if your best estimate is 3 degrees, well, even the probability of getting 5 on that same pathway is non-trivial. It's maybe in the region of 10% or something, because of the really large uncertainty in how the climate responds. So the third thing we have to do is to keep investing in technology. Those things that have a 40-year lead time, they're going to be enormously important in 40 years, so we better start investing in them now.
Thank you. Can I ask one question, sort of government question? When I was in Paris, I heard alarm from the French delegation, a member of the French delegation, and a member of the EU delegation about what the UK was doing in terms of its domestic policy. I've counted 15 now 16 after the carbon capture and storage decision, 16 decisions since the election that, in my view, would be liable to increase emissions. I wonder if you could give us a view on that.
It's a good question to ask. And it's one that, a lot of people have been asking. And the response from our ministers has been mainly to say, look, we're completely committed to our carbon budgets, to meeting those over time. And this is in fact an incredibly strong institutional system that we have in the UK that I think it's fair to say no other country has, certainly not any major developed economy. We have legally binding carbon budgets that are set based on independent advice and that take us in 5-year steps all the way down to a level of per capita emissions in 2050 that is broadly consistent with the 2-degree target. That if all the countries in the world got down to that same level, which is about 2 tons per person per year, we'd be roughly on track for 2 degrees. And so if you're committed to meeting those targets, it basically means if you abolish some policies, well, at some point you have to come up with other ones to put in their place.
And are you seeing the government coming up with those new policies to replace the old ones?
I think that's a continuous ongoing process.
Is that a yes? Is that a yes?
Well, let me give an example. Let me give an example. The Green Deal, okay? Green Deal was supposed to incentivize insulation in houses. Now, I looked into this myself because I thought I would like to have insulation in my house, and I'd also like to understand how this policy works, so I'm going to go through it. I got about as far as the first step and spent a couple of £100 and then gave up because it was so incredibly complex and it didn't make sense anyway. It was going to charge me an interest rate of something like 8% to get some insulation. I could borrow that money much more cheaply from a bank and just do it without going through this whole process. So I have no idea how that was supposed to work, ever. And it clearly didn't. It only had a few hundred people signing up. So nobody's really lamenting the fact that that's been abolished. Has it been replaced yet? No, but I think everybody's very clear that it will need to be replaced. You can't not insulate the house.
Thank you very much. So in terms that my teenager son would understand, government scraps rubbish policy and doesn't replace it. So, Michael,
I just felt I'd better put up an advertisement, I hate to say this, Roger, but one of my last actions before heading off to Paris was finally uploading a report, some of you I haven't know about, called UK Energy Policy, Politicisation or Rationalisation. And it tries to run through what's been done, what are the arguments why, the government's offered as to why they've been done, and rather unfortunately, shortly after that I had sent one tweet saying that's one more on the bad side of the ledger. I'm pleased to say this morning I sent one tweet saying I think the solar decision yesterday actually looks to me pretty rational, pretty well judged, good role, but I wonder now if we actually are stabilising the situation.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I reported a solar decision yesterday, and I had asked the solar industry to just give you a little idea of how the media works, which might be quite useful. I was asked to report on it for morning bulletins, but the decision was not announced until 7 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't get to see it until about 7:20. I was on the phone to the Solar Trade Association, and I'd said to them previously the government were looking at, I think, a 97% cut from memory in terms of support for rooftop solar on houses. And I said, look, the easiest thing for me is if I get a comparison to, if it's less than 97, then the cut is softer than before. And so we were talking on the phone, and they said, yeah, it's going to be 64%, so my story was cut softer than before. Then later on, I had another few conversations and realised actually that wasn't the real story. The real story was that the government had capped the installation of solar at a level which the industry says is not viable and won't allow the industry to grow. And I haven't checked this figure because I've been doing other things, but according to the industry, the solar is now getting 1% of the total green energy funding from government, which, and if true, one would want to ask some questions about that. So I think the solar thing is still yet to be unpicked. And the decision was announced on the same day as the fracking under national parks decision, and the same day as the EU summit, which is all a massive coincidence, isn't it? We'll hear from Dan Osborn now about how the decisions from Paris will be translated to a local level.
Thanks very much, Roger. Yeah, my interests are in how some of these global decisions translate and that is really important in this case, because if you look at the agreement, it's very dependent on the individual decisions of the parties that have signed the agreement. It all depends on what each individual country does, and of course what the major big players do. When you look at agreements like this, you have to ask about where is the starting point, and how will policy people look at how they interpret that starting point for the individual countries. Because there isn't as yet an internationally agreed way in which the numbers will get added up and examined. So translating that kind of thing to the local level, when you go from the global to individual nations, and then you go below to the subnational level to see how individual communities can act to help with the implementation of this kind of agreement, things get to be very, very challenging and very, very difficult. And you might think the technologies take 40 years to put into place, but getting this kind of action in place at the community level takes about the same amount of time in all probability. So when we're looking at that kind of thing, it gets to be important when you look at climate change risk assessments. And I'm involved in the UK climate change risk assessment, the evidence report of that, and I'm looking at a number of community level effects there. And it's really hard to detect whether communities are responding appropriately at the moment, let alone giving them another target or set of targets to go for which are not well defined. One thing that communities need is clarity about what actions they need to take. If that can be set out, then communities will act, and communities include local businesses and bigger businesses, etc. So I think although the agreement has done a lot in principle, it's going to be how that global activity is translated to local action that really is going to make a difference.
What sort of things are you specifically looking for?
Well, how people talk about uncertainties. I'm not a scientist as such, but I feel much less uncertain about the situation. I don't think the UN is acting in a precautionary fashion. I think it's doing the sensible thing because we know sea levels are rising. So if you look at the risk to communities from sea level rise, even of 0.5 metre or 1 metre, which we could get in some parts of the world this century, from the kinds of emissions we've already had, let alone now adding more, then there are communities that are and will be at risk. And these are not just the small island states. So how do those communities adjust? What help would we give them to those communities? If we get much higher levels of sea level rise, then major cities like Shanghai and other coastal cities, where a lot of the global economic resources, they will be at risk. And it costs between $10 and $60 billion to protect a city. If you translate that worldwide, then you can see why we need to act very quickly to get these emissions down. And I don't feel uncertain about that at all.
But there's a lot of, in the report, again, threaded through the report, there's a consistent theme of adaptation.
Absolutely.
Is that not clear enough for you? I'm not quite sure what it
You've got two different things. You've got two different things, Roger. You've got a need to mitigate, and then you've got a need to adapt to the emissions that have already and will occur. You've got to do both things together. We've thought about them separately previously, but we need to join those things together. So it's not that I'm complaining about anything. I think it's an excellent step forward in many ways. I am a little bit sceptical about how things will be translated into local action without a lot more clarity at the international and national level.
Thank you. Paul, could you pick up and offer some general thoughts on the meeting? But also specifically, we haven't talked about market mechanisms, which did feature in the final results. So if you offer any thoughts on those, that would be useful.
Yeah, if I may, Roger, I'll do something a little different. Because I want to speak unashamedly to the MSc students who are here, because this is one of their lectures. And I want to give you an exam question, because you'll be taking the exam. At the end of this course. This won't be an exam question, but it's the kind of exam question you might get. So it is, what does the theory of global public goods tell us about the likely success or otherwise of the Paris Agreement? Okay, now we've covered all that stuff in the environmental economics course. And I just want to run through a few thoughts that pick up on some of the things that we've heard, that give you a flavour of the kind of analytical processes that I hope you'll be going through when you come to the real questions. So you know a global public good is non-excludable and non-rival. You know that there are very strong incentives for free riding in a global public good. You know the Scott-Barrett classification of global public goods. You know that climate change is an aggregate effort of the good. In order for us to address it, it's got to be addressed by a minimum coalition. And we've got the minimum coalition through the nationally determined contribution. The minimum coalition is probably 80% of emissions. Well, we're well above that. You know that all countries want the benefits of the global public good, a stable climate in this case. But you know that if other people will pay for it and they don't, you can't exclude them from those benefits. So you know the cost-benefit analysis is that you try to do it and you try to get others to do it and you stay out. And normally, to get a global public good, you have to have penalties that are more than the costs of compliance. And penalties where there's a high probability of them being applied. And we know from what Michael said that there are no enforcement mechanisms in the Paris Agreement. So why on earth should we think that this is going to stick? And I've got 5 quick reasons. Firstly, huge diplomatic pressure to sign up. What the French did was really important. Without those commitments, there would be absolutely nothing to go for. Once you've signed up, you immediately have a cost if you renege. And it's a diplomatic cost, and it'll be a financial cost. And so the pressure to conform with international law, which is what Michael specifically said. Then, of course, the economics is important. And we've heard, first of all, that the short-term costs of compliance with these NDCs is nothing like as high as countries thought they were going to be. Nothing like as high as they thought they were going to be in Copenhagen. That's the innovation story. That's the reduction in the short-term costs of compliance. And then there's the whole dynamics of innovation and momentum story that says, in the medium term, low carbon could be a real economic opportunity. It's something we've got to get over our hump, we've got to get the costs down further, but if we get in there now, we'll be part of that group of countries which is leading it. And the work of the New Climate Economy Group, led by, with Nixon playing a leading role, but lots of other people too, has been really important in putting that across. So that's why there is a possibility, despite the fact that there's no enforcement mechanism, there's a possibility that the Paris Agreement will stick, but it depends enormously, just as Roger said, on this dynamics, this momentum, this innovation story playing out over the next 5 years in such a way that countries really feel, yep, it's not a question of no burden sharing. Here is a question of us making investments to get into a club that really works. On the carbon pricing stuff, I mean, obviously I've been hopeful for a global carbon tax for a long, long time. It's interesting, I've read quite a few blogs and lots of people saying they knew a global carbon tax wouldn't come out of this. And of course that was right, it wasn't going to come out of it. But Michael didn't say very much about the kind of carbon pricing coalition that is moving forwards, the countries and the companies that are calling for carbon pricing, and indeed some of them doing it internally. I think that's going to be a strengthening dynamic. One of the blogs I read was a guy who said after Copenhagen that the entire UN Framework Convention process was dead. He now acknowledged he was wrong, but he still thinks he's right, that the global carbon tax isn't going to come back. To me, it's so obvious that a global carbon tax where countries keep the revenues internally is one of the cheapest and simplest ways of addressing this issue that I cannot imagine that's not going to be put forward seriously at some point in the future. I'd like someone to talk a little bit about this high ambition coalition, which wasn't mentioned at all. This group of countries that came together, spanning some of the poorest countries that were the worst hit by climate change, with some of the richest countries, and to some extent putting pressure on some of the more bloody-minded emerging economies as they might have been. On the technology and innovation story in the 40 years, I don't think this is about basic research leading to innovation. This is about technologies that we already know quite a lot about coming together. The two key ones in my view are storage and ICT, innovation communication technologies. The marriage of ICT with energy is going to be one of the really big innovation stories of the next 5 to 10 years, and that needn't take 30 years. It won't take 30 years. Look at mobile telephony, which happened much more quickly than that. And I think the final thing I'll say is, please don't laugh at the prospect of President Trump. It really isn't funny, as Hillary Clinton said the other day. Luckily, I think it's a relatively long shot about him being elected. But boy, does that stand for everything that goes against the kind of multilateral process we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Just keep it for a second, Paul. I mean, I'd like to really endorse that point about ICT. There are really revolutionary things happening at the moment, and probably want you to talk about that more. But I just want to ask you about the domestic situation in the UK. You know, if you ask the Treasury, the government, they will all say we're absolutely committed to meeting all our targets. The previous architecture of subsidies was really messy and shambolic, and the Liberal Democrats had insisted on giving too much money away to these really rather ineffective technologies, solar and wind. We had to put it right. We're in an age of austerity, but we will meet our targets. What's your view on that?
Well, I'm on record as saying I don't agree with it at all. I think it's top, and I think the current position of the UK government policy is completely incoherent and inconsistent. I think that the issue of money is negated by the fact that they're subsidising to an enormous extent one of the most expensive low-carbon technologies, i.e. nuclear. And we know what that subsidy is, and it's far, far more than we're ever going to be paid to renewables after 45 years of its operation. The renewable technologies have actually proved themselves to be highly effective. We've gone from 4 to 20% of our electricity coming from renewable sources in a very short period of time. Back to 2007, if you'd asked me, within 10 years we go from 4 to 20% of electricity from renewables, I would definitely have said no. And the fact is that onshore wind and solar, even in England, are the most competitive low-carbon technologies. And I think it's completely insane when we've spent a fair bit of money building up these industries to cut them off at the knees, just when the industries themselves were prepared to make commitments that they would be subsidy-free by 2020. So what am I looking for these policies that Simon says are still in the pipeline? Well, if George Osborn had the courage of his convictions and said, okay guys, we're going to cut all these subsidies, but we're going to have a carbon tax at £70 a tonne, which is roughly where it ought to be, where the Treasury numbers for carbon taxes are, and we're going to introduce it from now, and there are not going to be any exemptions because sound economics operates through internalising externalities, carbon taxes, and rather than through subsidies. Well, I'd have thought at least there's a shred of economic logic in that argument, and obviously I would have supported it. But what we've seen is complete nonsense. There you go. I'm an academic.
I work for the BBC and I don't have any thoughts on anything whatsoever. But I would say that it's our job to ask questions, and I met a solar entrepreneur in the preliminary conference to Paris, which took place in Bonn, and he said, what is all the fuss about? I could come to the UK right now and build solar farms, ground-mounted solar farms, with no subsidy at all.
Yeah.
He wasn't, but he would make more money elsewhere, but he said he could launch ground-mounted solar right now without subsidy, to put the other point of view. Anyway, we're now going to hear on another topic from the talks, which we haven't touched on yet, and that is land use. Land use, forestry tend to often get forgotten when we're talking about climate change. We consistently think in terms of cutting emissions, particularly in terms of electricity. We neglect transport. We particularly neglect heating, which is absolutely massive in terms of emissions. We focus almost everything on electricity, I think to the detriment of rational debate. And I was talking to Nick Stern recently. He said, look, you know, the simplest things, the cheapest things for us to do is firstly keep existing forests, and secondly restore degraded land. So Rachel Warren is going to talk a little bit about those things and other allied matters.
So, yes, Roger, in order to achieve, to reduce global temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we are going to have to manage extremely carefully our land and water resources, and we're going to have to do that on a global scale. This is an enormous challenge, and now the reason why that is the case is because most of the integrated models, I presume that Michael has taught you what an integrated model is, that look at the technologies required to get below 2 degrees, and coupling those to climate models, which tell you how much you need to reduce emissions to get below 2 degrees, say that we need a huge contribution from the technology of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and that is actually to make negative emissions. So you are creating, using biofuels, but you are actually capturing that carbon and burying it essentially to create negative emissions. And most of these global models cannot achieve 2 degrees, and certainly not 1.5 degrees, without a large fraction of that technology. That technology is extraordinarily land thirsty, and it's also very water thirsty. So if you're going to go out and grow biofuels, you have to get that land from somewhere. So are you going to take it from natural ecosystems? They're already under huge threat, and one of the central aims of Article 2, which Michael talked about, is actually to stabilise the greenhouse concentrations at a level such that ecosystems can adapt naturally. One of the best things we can do to help ecosystems adapt naturally is to protect existing ecosystems, and also to create what are called corridors to allow ecosystems and species to move. The reason that's necessary is that ecosystems and species are constrained by climate. As climate changes, all of those plants and animals, we're already seeing this, are starting to move polewards and up mountains. And if we have urban areas, agricultural deserts, as ecologists call them, between our natural ecosystems, they will not be able to move. So if in doing our mitigation, we are removing natural ecosystems, we are, as far as that aspect of Article 2 is concerned, literally shooting ourselves in the foot. Another important aspect of this is that, okay, you could grow these biofuels on existing agricultural land. You are then displacing land that is currently used to grow crops. It is projected that by 2050 the demand for food will actually be doubled. So if we are doing that, it means that somebody somewhere else is going to then cut down the forest to grow crops, because that food demand is going to have to be met from somewhere. So that means that land management is absolutely critical to getting to 2 degrees or less in a sensible way that does not compromise either food production or natural ecosystems. Those are 2 of the 3 things that Article 2 itself is trying to protect. Now, this induced land use, this indirect land use change that comes from bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, can actually completely offset all of the emission reductions you get from bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So it's not only that you're affecting food systems and ecosystems, it's that because that induced land use change then emits carbon to the atmosphere, it actually doesn't reduce temperatures anyway, or only by perhaps a very small amount if you're lucky. So it is absolutely critical that if we do apply global carbon taxes, that these include a tax on terrestrial carbon, so that emissions released by removal of release of carbon from terrestrial ecosystems to the atmosphere is counted as emission and is taxed. And so I was very happy to see that there is a procedure called reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. It's called REDD for short. That is mentioned actually in the Paris Agreement, and in particular, Statement A, the agreement says that there should be achieved a balance between the sources and sinks. So one of the key sinks is forest, the other one is the ocean. So you can't have that balance if you're removing forest. And secondly, that parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. So they're being encouraged to conserve forest. And when I was at the COP21, I noticed a very strong presence from what's called the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, and they were all very keen that efforts to preserve forest on their part would be recognised as part of their contribution to solving the climate change problem. They have wonderful displays in their country pavilions showcasing their country's biodiversity, and in many cases showcasing the efforts that their country have gone to protect their ecosystems, particularly Mexico, have a wonderful display on this. And also emphasise the role that their countries playing in adaptation, doing ecosystem-based adaptation, that is using ecosystems to help people adapt to climate change. And that's because many of the things that you do to protect ecosystems also protect people from climate change. So there's a real win-win scenario there. So in summary, meeting this challenge of 2 or 1.5 degrees is going to require incredible expertise on how we manage our land. And I was actually at a side event on the last day I was in Paris, seeing some latest results from an institution that I collaborate with that were running a land use allocation model. And they actually reckoned that they'd found a way of getting to 2 degrees using agricultural intensification, changes in diet, as we've already heard earlier today, and a great deal of ecosystem restoration. Most unfortunately, they had called that ecosystem restoration afforestation. Afforestation to many people means planting monocultures of non-native trees on land, which is ecological suicide, or almost. So it's very important that when this is done, it is restoration of the natural ecosystems and not the planting of non-native species. And another reason why this all has to be managed very carefully is that a lot of biofuel cropping is very water intensive. That water also has to be shared out between agricultural cropping, biofuels and natural ecosystems, and of course domestic supply as well. So this whole idea is called the land water energy nexus, and it's an area of incredibly intense research going on at the moment in the academic community. We're seeing an explosion of this and looking at how these climate change goals relate to the other sustainable development goals requires thinking about how do we deliver all these goals by managing land and water very carefully. So that's really the next challenge after the others you've been hearing about today.
Thank you. If you want to know more about this issue, there's a very interesting interview from Tim Lenton at Exeter on this website, which I commend to you. So I did 3 half-hour documentaries called Changing Climate, which I think probably would be of interest to you. They're on the BBC, they're under Changing Climate. But also, all the interviews that I've done for that series are on an OU website, which is creativeclimate.org. And there's a fantastic resource. The idea of the series was to be an academic resource for people like yourselves to go in and rip off quotes and get original stuff that nobody else would see. So, I mean, I did commend that to you. But Tim Lenton calculated that in order for us to get to something like 2 degrees or 1.5, that we would need to plant with biofuel crops, an area of land the size of India.
Yeah, well, there are a number of people who publish these very large estimates. And what I would say about this is that it depends hugely on the assumptions that you make about how technological changes in agriculture might change things. So the things that you can do to reduce that huge amount of land that you need is to intensify agriculture, to encourage people to eat less meat. People will be looking at...
That's a bit formal though, isn't it? Who's going to be... Put up your hands if you're willing to be vegetarian.
Oh, but that's not what I said.
This is a biased group. No, you don't have. You're
but there is no way that people who want to move the earth on a more sustainable pathway will get anywhere by saying that we should all be vegetarians. It isn't going to happen. You know, it would be a political suicide. What I am saying is that people can eat less meat, and also
but is that realistic?
Well, meat
with China wanting to eat
meat would be made more expensive, and then less people will be able to afford to eat it so often. There are also health benefits for eating less red meat actually. Red meat is
there are, but we're talking about culture. This is the burger generation you're addressing. You're the lentil generation. This is the burger generation. They are the future. Is there anybody here who doesn't eat burgers? If you're not a vegetarian, you don't eat burgers. There you go. Right. That was mischievous,
but I am a journalist, and that's a sort of sneaky, naughty thing to do. Michael, could you offer a few thoughts on market mechanisms, given this is an economics class?
It's an economics and policy class, and since this is a session about the international, Roger whispered in my ear and asked, what about market mechanisms in the Paris Agreement? Well, this is actually a really interesting question, because I think the piece that we circulated from Axel says market mechanism is one of the big achievements of the Paris Agreement. It's kind of interesting. I read it through, and I've just called up the text to check. As far as I can see in the Paris Agreement, there is no reference at all to carbon pricing. The word market only appears in the context of non-market measures. It does so, however, in the context of Article 6, which is one of these wonderful examples of how you really need to understand what's behind the language. Because Article 6, and we'll see if I'm really challenged here with my little phone, it basically is, it talks about a mechanism. Parties recognise that some parties choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions. Where they're on a voluntary basis in cooperative approaches that involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, promote sustainable development, ensure environmental and transparency, including governance.
But you've got it there, Michael.
But I just wanted to stress it. Article 6.4, a mechanism to contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, support sustainable development, is hereby established under the authority and guidance of the Conference of Parties. And it lists what that mechanism is. That is the reference broadly to economic instruments. You wouldn't have guessed it, would you? But it is actually very important. It is being seized upon because it was well known that that was the solution to the fact that actually, and I think we really do underestimate this, there is an enormous gulf between the world of the international diplomacy and the way that most economists think. And they simply do not see the world in the same way. What you do, however, see and witness in Paris is a collection of things around it. First of all, about 1819, the INDCs explicitly referred to the desire to meet implementation jointly with other parties. In other words, they plan to say we can deliver this much if we can include our activities to help other countries reduce emissions through trade transfer, maybe linking with emissions trading systems. That's effectively what that mechanism really is there for. It is because 18 countries said we cannot sign this agreement unless the potential to do that is in there, and other parties said, well, it's better to have it inside and governed in a way that prevents, and the example everybody cites is Japan unilaterally deciding that exports of more efficient coal technology accounts as an emission reduction when it's exported to developing countries. So you have a governance framework around actually trying to at least protect the accounting integrity of international transfers, which is getting pretty close to an international market. The other thing you see is the pricing angle itself is not, UN is not the venue for that discussion. Forget it. It is in some of the most sensitive domestic political territory you can imagine. What you do see, however, was encapsulated both in the first day, where you had, for example, the launch of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which included, it's one of these fascinating innovations in governance, it included California, Quebec, Ontario, 2 other Canadian provinces, then the new Canadian government coming in and saying, yeah, us too, actually, and Mexico, and Chile, and Morocco, and 9 European countries, interestingly not including the UK, saying we will collaborate in the implementation of pricing carbon. And then on the podium, on the final hour, with President Hollande moving to close the conference, he said, oh, and by the way, France is launching a coalition for carbon pricing. And along the way, you'd also had the G7 announcing their carbon pricing coalition. So that's where carbon pricing will come into the system, and it will be a sort of bottom-up cooperation on how on earth do we go about this, help each other to navigate the difficult political waters. But don't look to the UN to do the carbon pricing. It can govern the transfer of emission allowances to underpin international market mechanisms, and even that's pretty hard forward because some countries out there still fundamentally regard markets as rich world ways whereby rich people can buy their way out of emission constraints. And that remains a concern of those countries.
Right, splendid. Thank you very much. Now, do we pass the microphone round for questions?
We have the microphones, and then the people that want.
Okay, can I take questions and comments? So that guy's in my eye, and then there's a woman here. So let's take 3 at a time. So the gentleman here, a woman here, and then a third person, the guy down here in the black. Okay, fine. Yeah, you're open. Just say your name so I know, and keep it brief.
Sure. My name's Ben. I was wondering to what extent you thought being positive about COP21 could create a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's my question.
Okay, thank you. And so then there's a guy here, and then a woman.
What's the question?
It was this man here with the sort of greyish shirt.
Hello, my name is Bujing Wang from Anglia Institute. My question is about the financing debate between developing countries and developed countries. We've seen that at least from Chinese media, there is a lot of debate saying that it is because the intransparent process of financing, which I mean the $100 billion from developed countries to developing countries to support their technology. I guess that's still a big barrier for the financing to reach an agreement. So what really happens in COP21 that actually made the developing countries, for example China, agree on this issue? And what do you say is the major progress on that? Thank you.
Thank you. And the third was a woman here somewhere.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say quickly about the idea of whether stuff is realistic. I feel like we're here because current business as usual is not realistic in terms of, kind of long-term survival. So that doesn't seem to me to be particularly sort of relevant, only in the short term maybe. My question is, in terms of, it's probably more for Roger, what do you think the role and responsibility of the media is going to be going forward from Paris? Would you like to see a change in the way that issues relevant to climate change are being reported? Maybe you could comment on the reporting of the floods recently in the UK? Thanks.
Why don't I start with that? I was on the feedback programme on BBC Radio 4 last Friday when we were asked this question specifically, with one listener very angry that they felt that we hadn't reported climate change or mentioned climate change sufficiently in terms of the flooding. Now, clearly, to me, it is essential that from time to time we do mention the role or the presumed role of climate change in flooding. Remember, we don't have any hard, concrete scientific data yet to link these floods with climate change, although we would expect higher rains with a warmer atmosphere. So my answer was that yes, we should mention it, and we should mention it proportionately, but it's very difficult to define what proportionately is. So if, for instance, my colleague David Shupman, he did mention it once on the 10 o'clock news, the TV news, should we then mention the climate change link on the Today programme in the World at One programme and the 6 o'clock radio news and the 6 o'clock TV news? Should we mention it again on Newsnight? Do you know what I mean? It's kind of how much do we have to do to report it? I mean, we don't want to preach, we can't preach, and so it is a difficult one. And in terms of the way forward, I would like most for us to try to report this issue with a bit more consistency. That there have been times over the years when I've been one of just a very few numbers of people reporting on climate change because news editors lost interest. And I think a lot of news editors will see this outcome and they think, okay, that's climate change solved then. You know, they were all happy in Paris, so let's forget it now. And you will almost inevitably see a drop in coverage. It's very difficult to get sustained coverage of anything. We get bored, and our audiences get bored too, you must remember that. So that there will be a drop-off, but I hope that journalists will continue to look into the ramifications of this, because they are absolutely massive, and we haven't really started to unpick that yet. Do you want to talk about media, or do you want to talk, I need somebody to talk about how the question about what's our responsibility in presenting positivity?
So I strongly believe, but this is my personal opinion, I'm not a social scientist, that being positive about it will help it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In my profession, I've done a lot of work on projecting climate change impacts. This is obviously a very negative thing to do, getting messages out there about all of those impacts. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, it will make people concerned about climate change and want to act. But actually, I always present those results in terms of what impacts could be avoided if we reduce emissions. And the reason I do that is because it's a positive message. And I've also had, a lot of people coming to me saying, oh, surely you think we can never get to 2 degrees? And I say to them, well, if you go around saying that, you'll be right. I really think we need to be positive. We need to work out how to solve this problem of managing land, as I said. So I'm a strong believer in that people won't act collectively if there isn't a positive atmosphere. And as Michael said, there's a hugely positive atmosphere in Paris, and look what happened.
Okay, can I just ask, are you positive about us getting to 1.5?
I'm positive that we can get close to it.
I do think, on Ben's question a bit, I do think it's important to have a very positive approach about what needs to be achieved and to be clear to people about it, but you also have to be really realistic. If you want to convince a minister to take a decision, or a local politician to make some decision that is a bit counterintuitive, then you do need a lot of clarity and a lot of reality. You have to explain the detail as to why a particular measure will work and why that is better than taking another one. And I do agree very much with Paul about these issues of where government policies can be inconsistent when looked across the piece. And that tends to undermine the positivity that can come from the scientific or the technological community. But there needs to be a whole process by which we're being positive about the need and the possibility of achieving something, but realistic in political terms about how difficult it's going to be to achieve it unless, using a favourite political term, hard choices are made. Like Paul said, carbon tax, that would be a hard political choice, but it would give leadership, if they want to take a leadership position, and it would provide clarity. The markets would say, wow, the UK is really serious. And they might also then say, this is a good place to be investing in new technology. Or how do we get solar spun out across the temperate zone in the world? That kind of move would really be a very big positive signal to the market. So, positivity in that kind of sense would be really good.
I'll add
very briefly, because I want to get some more questions.
No, absolutely. I mean, firstly, as you will know from your behavioral economics, humans are an aspirational species. We aspire to things, and that's how we achieve stuff. So it may not be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but unless it's aspirational, we don't stand a chance. So that's why burden sharing was such an appalling way of framing that issue. It may have been realistic at the time because of the availability or non-availability of cost-effective technology, but now that we've cracked that problem, we're on the way to cracking it, it's got to be an aspirational message. Nothing's going to fulfill it. And on the media messaging stuff, it seems to me really important that we recognize that weather is how most people experience climate. And there was quite a long time when climate scientists were saying, oh, we're climate scientists, but we don't discuss the weather. That's the job of the Met Office. And I'm pleased to say the Met Office has done quite a lot to overcome that now, because obviously climate becomes weather. And that's how people understand it. And I think it's terribly important that that kind of messaging becomes much more common in the media, because it is the weather which is how climate will be expressed, and we need to recognize it.
Okay, thank you.
I should say, from the BBC point of view, we're not going to be taking either a positive or a negative slant. And if my colleagues, particularly my editors, heard these sort of comments, they would just have a whiff of manipulation about them. It's like, okay, we've got to get messaging in here. Editors don't want to hear about messaging. They want to hear about the best we can do for straight reporting. So we'll have to play straight on that. I want to go to Simon to ask you the Chinese question. How did the Chinese get pulled round in the last vote?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll sort of address that question as I understood it, as directly as I can, and then make a few other comments. So I think the question was, what was it that caused China to agree to the finance elements of the deal? Well, I think, to be honest, China never really had a big problem with them. Actually, the really interesting thing is China is now contributing climate finance itself. I forget how much. But, right. So it's not a recipient, it's now a giver, which is wonderful. Now, of course, China loudly complained for quite a while that the finance on the table from developed countries was not enough. But China never wanted to receive any of that itself. So you can quite straightforwardly recognize that that was a negotiating tactic designed to put pressure on the developed countries to maintain the leverage to help China get the kind of deal it wanted. In the end, China felt the overall package was acceptable and in fact good, so China came on board and supported it. I think just on that question of finance, really the more important question is not so much how much climate finance are we going to put on the table, because really that's how long is a piece of string question. The important thing is 100 billion a year is nothing compared to the amount of wealth that the global economy has and the level of assets, the trillions of assets that are invested in stock markets around the world. And what we really need to think about, much more importantly, is how can you change the incentives of financial markets so that they're a little bit less short-term, a little bit more long-term, and start sending that investment to the directions we want it to go. And that is, in fact, something that we're working together with the Chinese on as part of a G20 working group on sustainable finance. If I can comment really briefly on the other two questions, I very much agree with what the perceptions question. For me, it boils down to honesty. Sure, you can talk up the deal and hope it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that's only going to work for so long. If you do keep on going in the right direction, it's going to work. If you don't, then very quickly that will fall apart. So it's more important to be honest. You have to be honest about the scale of the problem, which if you truly assess it as a risk in the most systematic way that you can, which is what I was doing over the last couple of years with colleagues in China and India and the US, then you find out, in fact, it's deeply fragile how big the problem is. But if you're honest about the prospects for solving it, then I think you can be honestly hopeful as well. You can see a lot of the things Paul was talking about, actually opportunities to solve it in a way that's good for your economy and your overall well-being at the same time. Maybe, no, I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you. Let me take three more. So there's one in front there, then a man, and then I have the front of this guy on the far side as well. 1, 2, 3. So it's the woman in the front here, please, to start with, the woman in the chair.
Yeah, in the light of the Paris Agreement, what do you think about the prospects for CCS, and particularly in terms of getting the right levels of investment in CCS, and I mean globally, not just the UK's decision?
Okay, thank you. There's somebody here, that gentleman, great. Check. Look, turn behind you, the mic's going.
My name is Rohit, I'm a student of this MSc. My question was to do with what response do you see from the fossil fuel lobbies, which are quite powerful in a number of countries, US, China, Australia, OPEC countries? Do you see them lobbying to cut back on national agreements? Do you see them divesting into renewables, or what other responses do you foresee?
Okay, thank you. And then this one over here.
Hi, my name is Michael Page. I'm the environment reporter for the Science magazine. I just wanted to very briefly comment on what Roger had said about not being positive and negative. I think as a journalist it's impossible not to be biased in some sort of way. The facts you choose to present and the order you choose to present inevitably is a positive or negative slant to anything. And then coming to this question of positivity, I want to ask the panel, do you think that by so many academics I see are trying to spin their findings in a positive way? And do you think there's not a danger that by doing this, politicians get away with doing too little too late?
Okay, just give us an example of that, would you?
Well, we've just seen it, yeah. I mean, I think, you sort of said, well, we can get close to 1.5. I mean, I think, realistically, the prospects of reaching 1.5, it's gone now. 2 degrees Celsius has probably gone too, because we need such huge negative emissions.
So you're unhappy about academics trying to be positive about a message which you think is fundamentally negative. Is that right?
Well, I'm asking, obviously people are saying, we've got to try and be positive about it, we've got to aspire to solve this problem. I'll turn it around and say, politicians have been allowed, they're not doing enough, they're not doing it fast enough, we've got to do a lot more. But the pressure on them is not as great as it should be, possibly, potentially, because people like you are not saying, you're not doing enough, we need to do more, we need to do it today.
Rachel, you mean Anne Gloston?
Okay, so what I would say is that there are actually, most academics are saying that we can't get to 2 degrees and that we definitely can't get to 1.5 and we can't get to 2. Now at the moment, if you look at the models, that the models say is what I was explaining in my whole thing. You can't get to 2 or below without massive amounts of negative emissions. It does look very unlikely. What I said is if you go around saying to everybody, this is very unlikely, then things will never move forward from that. We won't innovate, we won't develop ways of solving that problem. I'm not saying there is a way of solving that problem, but there could be, and we're for sure not going to find it if we go around saying it's impossible. That's what I mean. Yes, I think that as academics, you know, we should be honest about what the land requirements are. So I said earlier, yes, there are these huge land requirements. That's what I said in my spiel. But I also said there are ways of reducing that land requirement by changing our diet and by making agriculture more intensive. So there are ways that we can reduce that land footprint and thus be able to achieve more negative emissions. And I think that, you know, yes, we have a responsibility to say with our current technologies and what we think we can do, how low do we think we can get the temperature down to. We do need to be honest about that. I was just saying that we need to have a very positive attitude to solving that problem. Because I think if we go around saying, oh, we can't get anywhere near 2 degrees, there may be a back reaction and people will put their heads in the sand and nothing will happen.
Okay, thanks. Let's go down just briefly.
CCS is very important in principle because right from Roman and Victorian times we've known how to control pollution, and that's to stop stuff being emitted at source. So, you know, one of the best things we can do is find technology that really works, and we should be investing in developing those technologies. Go on.
Can I do the fossil fuels?
Yes.
Question, that gentleman
Yes.
there? Different companies will react in different ways. And it will be fascinating to see how they react. I mean, we know that the American Congress is like it is, partly because the Congress people have been bored by the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of evidence on that. And it's going to be interesting to see how long that remains a credible political strategy. And there will be people who break away. There will be fossil fuel companies who perceive that the writing is on the wall and that there's more money to be made elsewhere, and that therefore the medium long-term shareholder benefits justify them moving in a different direction. 2 of the largest oil companies tried that strategy 15 years ago, and we were all cheering them on, saying, yeah, go for it. But they were too far ahead of the governments, and the governments let them down. And the technologies they were then backing did not pay back sufficiently quickly, and so they've reverted to fossil fuels. It may be that we now see fossil fuel companies attempting to change. I think we are beginning to see it in the power generation sector, but obviously the big fossil fuel companies still have a long way to go.
Thank you. Just very briefly on that from my point of view, and I want 2 more questions or comments before we close. Fossil fuel companies already, they started to split, so oil and gas companies can see that they can still make money into the medium term. And they are now turning on coal and saying, well, you've got to squeeze out coal because that's the really dirty fuel. And that's the really big split you've seen. And when we're talking about lobbying, the Koch brothers, as you possibly know, the US fossil fuel business, are putting nearly $1 billion into the election, and they are not backing windmills. Let me take another couple of questions. So the man here and the woman there, these 2 people, to keep microphone movement to the minimum. So keep it very brief, please.
Hello, I'm Henry Witt. I'm from the Grubb Group, and they have worked with numerous people in business and government, including our sourcing again. So I'm wondering, two main quick questions. The one is, the Paris Pledge has agreed that there are 200 companies that have signed up to their own commitments to reduce their emissions, including RE100, which is 100% renewable. And also carbon pricing, how would that, if it's slowing down, so why is not every nation having a carbon price, and what are the key barriers to that? You mentioned the facts.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm at UCL, and I'm interested in looking at the gravity of the situation and systemic issues going on, how the concept of climate justice could have been better recognized within the agreement.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'll give a very brief one on carbon price. Imagine you're in the Treasury and you're taxing cars, that God knows what cars are taxed at, a vast amount in petrol, and And if you started to impose a carbon price, motorists would simply turn around and say, well, hang on a second, you know, you said you were taxing us on carbon. And government would, I suspect, be forced to put down the price of tax on cars in order to achieve a general carbon price. But that's me just being cynical. Michael is much better positioned to answer that than me.
Well, let me actually pick up two very different things. First, warm words will not sustain Paris for very long unless happens. The longer warm words continue without actions, then the greater the kind of risk that was perceived, that you sort of divorce, you create a happy feeling whilst things are going in the wrong direction. And I think that an example, a very specific example, is quite a few years a lot of researchers said, oh, energy efficiency is amazingly cost effective, it's great, it's going to be free, it's going to be cheap, it's going to be easy, we can solve this problem at no cost. To which government reaction was, great, don't need to do anything then. Right? And it completely was a disaster in terms of policy terms. It never got to the heart of why is efficiency difficult. So we better have an honest discussion, a hard-headed discussion about why is this difficult? Just how difficult is it? Just what needs to be done? Because that's the only way that you can know whether you're making progress. I think in terms of the academic role, you know, if academics can't be honest about all this, then who can, or who's likely to be? I think the difficulty I perceive is very often academics, however, pronounce on areas they know a lot about, and then loads of other areas with extraordinary degrees of either ignorance or attention, which can be problematic. And I referred to the massive wave of academia saying, oh, I didn't need the UN, it's completely irrelevant, waste of time, etc. And there were various political scientists who said, oh, no, you do not. So I think very often the political economy is a vital thing that a lot of academia is very weak at, and I would say the same around the 1.5. I actually sent out a tweet saying 1.5 is incompatible with democracy. Kind of expecting major trolling in response, but it's a really important
That
question.
didn't make you very popular, actually, Michael. I have to be there.
No, but it forces a debate about political conditions and how they deliver stuff in the real life.
Would you take the fairness question? I don't know if you're able to, because you may disagree with the premise, but the premise is that this agreement was not very fair, and how could it have been made more fair?
Ooh.
Let's make it all hypothetical. You don't work for the Foreign Office, okay, and...
I don't think I have an answer to that. I will try it, but I'd rather talk about the other. Maybe I'll talk about the other ones first, and then see if something's come up. On the 1.5 and the 2 degrees, I mean, for 1.5 degrees, we would have to do something heroic on a global scale and then get really lucky with the climate. I really hope that happens. For 2 degrees, we'd have to do something quite heroic and get quite lucky with the climate. So I really hope that happens too. I think both of them are long shots, one slightly longer than the other. Should you react by saying, oh well then, let's give up? No, that would be an insane thing to do. It would be completely illogical and obviously against all of your interests. If we're not going to meet 1.5, or if we're not going to meet 2, well, we're going to get something else. And guess what? There's quite a big difference between 3 and 6. So you better be worried about that. It's very clear. Whatever we're on track for, our interests are in keeping it down as much as we can. I think that's extremely clear. On carbon pricing, I wanted to address the question, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, actually, that's a great question, but it's really one of the most hopeful things, how far carbon pricing is spreading. And I'm glad to say that our country and the organisation I work for, the Foreign Office, has been part of that. We've been not only implementing it here in the UK and in the EU. In the EU, yes, the prices crashed, but the UK has been at the forefront of efforts to reform the EU emissions trading system to push the price back up again. And all around the world, we've been helping South Korea design their carbon pricing. South Africa, China, most importantly. China, we've helped them set up pilot carbon trading zones in 7 provinces so successfully that they're going to have a national carbon market 3 years ahead of schedule in only 2 years from now. And that's going to overtake the EU as being the biggest carbon market in the world. Now, is this politically difficult? Well, maybe, maybe not, and I think it depends how you do it. For me, the really interesting example is British Columbia, the province in Canada, where what they do is put a price on carbon and then give you the money back. And that doesn't stop it having any incentivized effect, because what it does is just make high carbon products, goods and services, more expensive compared to low carbon ones across the economy. Now, at the moment, when carbon prices are still quite low, it maybe doesn't matter so much how you design them. But in future, if they're getting up to those 70 pounds a tonne level that Paul was talking about, then a system where you give people back the money, I think, would have enormous political advantages. So finally, on the point, well, is it fair? Of course, we all know that the countries that have done the least so far historically to cause the problem are the ones that are going to suffer most. So no, that's not fair. But how do we think about fairness when we look to the future? Well, as I said, the UK's targets are designed to hit a level of emissions per capita by mid-century that if everybody in the world had, we would be roughly on track for 2 degrees, 2 tonnes per person per year. For me, I think that's the best measure of fairness going forward. That would be something good to aim for, because it implies that across the world, what you're aiming for ultimately is similar levels of living standards for everybody, and similarly ambitious, if you want to use that word, efforts to reduce emissions.
Okay, thank you. I think, Michael, I want to close this 3 minutes. I think I should draw it to a close now. We are due to be going for drinks, I understand. At least some of us. And I think it was more water to all. Is that okay? Is that another question or two? And there's a man here who put his hand up very quickly. This is the final question. Hang on a sec, you've got a microphone.
I'm James from the course. I was just really interested about your comments about agricultural intensification. What would that do to the nitrogen cycle, and what are the trade-offs there, and is there a technological solution that people are working on?
Yeah, and also what would it do to wildlife?
Yeah, okay, so you raise a very important point. Indeed, it would be very important to not use nitrogen fertiliser to intensify agriculture, because the N2O emissions that are emitted from agriculture are even stronger greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. So indeed, that should not be the way of doing it. There are people looking at very green ways of farming, no-till agriculture being a prominent one. I'm not really an expert on agricultural technologies, but yes, there is a lot of research going on in that area. The question of wildlife management is obviously an important one, particularly in relation to the need to create corridors. So in the UK, we have quite an unusual system in that our countryside isn't really a natural ecosystem anymore, it's a semi-natural ecosystem. So conservation in the UK is typically about how can we enhance that semi-natural ecosystem for wildlife. So whereas in other countries like the US, we have much more, big protected areas and big areas of intensive farming, and the protected areas are much closer to completely being in the state they've been in for thousands and millions of years. So there is a huge difference between the countries there, and I would certainly agree that there is a challenge and a difficulty in how do we best manage preservation of biodiversity and the intensification of agriculture. And I don't think there'll be the same solution in each country. I think it will be very place specific.
Thank you, Paul. Final word on carbon pricing.
Yeah, I can't resist carbon pricing, as you can imagine. And again, speaking to the MSc students, thanks, Simon, for mentioning the environmental tax reform idea, the revenue neutral carbon pricing, which you guys will all know quite a lot about. Why is carbon pricing difficult? Because it has competitiveness effects, it has distributional effects. So here's an exam question I'm not going to give you the answer to, which may or may not come up. How would you design a carbon pricing regime that addressed the competitiveness and distributional effects that have proved to be so difficult to overcome in the past? And finally, something Rachel just whispered in my ear, what about fossil fuel subsidies, for God's sake? I mean, that's one worse than carbon pricing, and yet we still routinely do it. In the UK, the biggest fossil fuel subsidy is the 5% VAT rate on household energy. Increasing that VAT rate to 20% would transform the economics of household energy efficiency and cause lots of people to look at it much more seriously. You mentioned that to politicians, as I did when I gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee. They said it's politically completely infeasible. So there we go. The political economy of these things is really, really tough.
There you go. If you wanted to end on an up note, tough. Can we thank this panel? Because I think this has been